Darius froze as Brent's voice cut through the hum of the crowded lobby, harsh and cold. The manager's voice echoed across the polished marble floors, stopping everyone in their tracks. "Darius, you're fired. You're no longer welcome here." Brent spat, his hand lifting the ID badge from Darius's chest, tossing it at his feet like a scrap of trash. "You people don't belong here." The words stung, sharper than the cold air in the room, as Darius stood there, humiliated and betrayed, under the harsh glow of fluorescent lights. Gasps filled the air. Guests turned their heads. The housekeepers who had once exchanged greetings with him in passing now avoided his gaze, shifting uncomfortably. The silence was deafening. The weight of the moment crushed him, but he didn't flinch. He kept his eyes locked on Brent's, the contempt in the manager's eyes burning through him. Darius had always worked hard. He had always been there, always done what was asked of him. Yet none of it mattered now. Not his years of service, not the hours he'd spent making sure guests were satisfied. Brent's words were a public shaming, a brutal reminder that in this world, his worth was always going to be less than his boss's. A few more words were exchanged, but they were a blur to Darius. It didn't matter. What mattered was the moment. The degrading public display of power. The sound of the badge hitting the floor like a final nail in the coffin. "Pack your things and leave," Brent added coldly. Darius didn't move. Rain pounded the windows as Darius stood there, his wet clothes clinging to his skin. The cold seeped through him, but it was nothing compared to the shiver running down his spine from the humiliation. Outside, the storm was fierce, but inside, the atmosphere was even heavier. Guests continued their conversations, some quietly glancing at him as they sipped their drinks. Others pretended to be busy with their phones. The indifference was suffocating. Darius stayed frozen, his mind racing. He wanted to scream, to demand justice. But all he could do was stand there, watching as the world moved on without him. No one spoke up. No one challenged Brent. The silence was louder than any insult. Somewhere deep in his chest, a knot began to form. This wasn't just about him. This was about every time he had been overlooked, every time he had been dismissed, every time the system had made him feel like a lesser person. The rain intensified, tapping against the glass, and for a moment, Darius felt as if he were caught in both storms, one raging outside and one storming inside him. Minutes earlier, Darius had been in the back of the hotel, doing what he had always done, helping, protecting. He had heard the noise before he saw it, shouting, followed by the sound of something crashing. When he entered the hallway, he found the housekeeper, a small woman with a tired face, struggling with a drunk VIP guest who had gone too far, his words slurred, his hands too rough. "Let her go," Darius had commanded, his voice firm, stepping forward to protect her. The man's eyes flickered with drunken confusion, then a sneer crossed his face. "Who the hell do you think you are?" Darius stood tall, his fists clenched, but his voice remained steady. "You need to leave, now." The guest snarled, muttering something about being too sensitive and overreacting. But Darius didn't back down. He didn't care that the man was a VIP. What mattered was that someone was being hurt, and he couldn't stand by and let it happen. That's when Brent had appeared, his face red, his eyes full of anger. He had barely let Darius explain before firing him on the spot. "You're too aggressive, Darius. You're a threat to the hotel's reputation," Brent had said, turning his back without a second glance. The truth was clear now. Darius had been terminated not for his actions, but for standing up, for not knowing his place. The power dynamics in the hotel had been too strong, and a black man daring to challenge authority had to be punished. The injustice of it all settled heavily on his shoulders, and for the first time, he felt the weight of every racial injustice that had come before. As Darius stood in that cold lobby, the last words Brent had whispered to him hung in the air, sharp and venomous. "You're just a uniform, Darius," Brent had said, his voice low enough that only Darius could hear. Nothing more. Just a tool to keep things running. You think you're special, but you're not. The insult had been a final blow, more damaging than the public shaming. It wasn't just about the job. It was about how Brent saw him, not as a person, but as something disposable. Darius didn't respond. He didn't need to. His silence was more powerful than any retort. Brent had no idea how deep his words had cut. But Darius wasn't just a uniform. He wasn't just an employee. He was a man, with dignity, with purpose. And no matter how many times the world tried to tell him otherwise, he wasn't going to let it break him. Just a uniform, Darius whispered to himself, standing taller, not letting the words define him. Brent's arrogance had always made him think he could get away with it, but this time, Darius wasn't backing down. Darius bent down slowly, picking up the badge that had been thrown at his feet. His hands were steady, his movements deliberate. He didn't look back at Brent or the onlookers. He didn't say anything, didn't need to. He could feel the weight of the badge in his hand, but it didn't define him. He wasn't going to be controlled by it. Turning on his heel, Darius walked out. The rain hit him immediately, cold and sharp, soaking him through. But it didn't matter. He wasn't walking away in defeat. He was walking with something far stronger, his pride. With his daughter's small hand in his, he held his head high. No matter what Brent had tried to take from him, no matter how deep the hurt had cut, Darius was still standing. The world had tried to define him in a moment, but it wasn't the end of his story. It was just the beginning. The door closed behind him, and the camera lingered on the rain, now pouring harder than ever. The storm was just getting started. "Darius, can you cover the south entrance tonight?" Brent's voice cracked through the intercom, his tone dismissive, but not unexpected. Darius exhaled slowly. It wasn't that he minded the work. It was the same every night. He had been a Marine before this, and in a way, the routine gave him peace. But peace was something he hadn't known for a long time. His wife, the love of his life, had passed away unexpectedly a year ago, leaving him with nothing but memories and a daughter to raise alone. His eyes flickered to a photo on his desk, a picture of him, his wife, and little Ava laughing on a beach. The image felt distant now, like a dream he couldn't reach. Raising Ava as a single father was his purpose, his driving force. Every day, he worked tirelessly to ensure she had a future free from the struggles he had faced growing up. But it was hard, and it was even harder when he had to leave her with a neighbor every night while he worked the graveyard shift at the upscale hotel. The work wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. It kept the lights on. It kept Ava safe. Darius stood up, adjusting his uniform and running his hand through his short, graying hair. A veteran's hands, calloused from years of service, now smoothed the fabric of his shirt as he straightened himself. His shoulders were heavy with the weight of the years, both the battles he'd fought abroad and the ones he fought here, in silence, day after day. "Yeah, Brent, I'll take care of it," Darius muttered before hanging up the intercom. His eyes drifted back to the photo. He was a quiet warrior now. No medals, no praise. Just a father doing what he could to keep his daughter's world intact. The hotel was beautiful. Its towering glass windows, the marble floors, the ornate chandeliers that hung down like beacons of wealth and privilege. But beneath the luxury and high society that walked through its polished lobby, there was a stark division. For all its elegance, the hotel was a microcosm of the very system that Darius fought against, both on the battlefield and within the confines of these walls. Black employees like him were relegated to the lowest of the low, the overnight security guards, the janitors, the kitchen staff. No one had ever questioned why it was like this. The system just was, and those who dared to challenge it were left behind. Darius had seen the way the guests interacted with the staff, polite but cold, a glance of superiority in their eyes. The managers, too, carried an air of detachment, as if the black faces in the hallways were nothing more than furniture. Invisible, disposable. He wasn't blind to it. He had seen how his co-workers, many of whom had been there for years, never received the same opportunities as the white employees. They would toil away, day after day, with no chance for upward mobility. He'd applied for promotions multiple times, his qualifications in the security field impeccable. But every application seemed to vanish into the ether, never reaching the decision-makers. Darius tried not to let it bother him. He focused on the work. But it was getting harder with each passing day. The cold truth was, despite his dedication, Darius's efforts were never seen by those who held the power. Brent, the manager, was always quick to praise him in front of guests. After all, it was his job to make the hotel look good. But behind closed doors, Darius was invisible. He had tried everything. After his military service, he had taken night classes, earning certifications that would open doors within hotel operations. But every time he applied for a position in the management side of the hotel, it was as if his applications disappeared. "Darius, we'll keep your resume on file," they would say. "Great qualifications, but we've gone with someone else for this position." It was always the same, every time. And what made it worse was the hollow compliment, the way they would smile at him like they truly cared. But Darius wasn't fooled. He knew exactly what was happening. He had learned to keep his frustrations to himself. He'd been taught to work harder, push further, and never complain. But now, the endless cycle of rejection was beginning to feel like a weight he couldn't carry alone. Darius had always dreamed of something more. Something beyond the security booth, beyond the dark hallways of the hotel. He wanted a future for Ava, something better than what he had. He wanted to move up, get into hotel operations, and eventually build a career where he could be proud of what he had achieved. But every time he reached for that dream, it was yanked out of his grasp. He'd spent years taking night classes in business management. Every course, every textbook, every late-night study session was focused on that goal. He had the skills. He had the vision. But the system had a way of shutting those doors. In his heart, Darius knew that the chances of breaking free were slim. Every rejection, every ignored application reinforced that belief. But he couldn't stop trying. He had to try, for Ava, for himself. But each time the door slammed in his face, he wondered, how long could he keep fighting this battle when the odds were so stacked against him? Darius had learned early on that silence was safer. He had learned to observe, to keep his thoughts to himself, and to bear the weight of microaggressions with a calm demeanor. The constant low-level racism, the sideways glances, the passive dismissals. It all had become part of the routine. But over the years, it had begun to build up, like an invisible weight pressing down on his chest. The quiet comments from guests, the way the managers spoke to him, as though he was invisible until they needed him. The way they never quite saw him as a person, just another black face in the crowd. He had remained quiet because he thought it was the only way to survive. But each day, the emotional toll grew heavier. And one night, as he stood by the elevator, listening to the hushed voices of his colleagues gossiping about him behind his back, he realized something. He could no longer remain silent. He had tried to be a good soldier, silent, compliant, invisible. But the weight of it all was starting to crack his resolve. And for the first time, Darius found himself wondering if he could continue to endure the constant erosion of his dignity. "Another night shift, Darius?" Brent's voice came through the intercom, as familiar as the weariness in Darius's bones. It was 9:30 p.m., and the last thing he wanted was another long, silent shift in the hotel lobby, watching the luxury of the place unfold, while his own dreams withered in the background. "Yeah, I'll take it," Darius muttered, his voice barely audible over the static. Darius had gotten used to it by now. The late shifts, the lonely hours spent guarding the hotel, while others enjoyed the comforts he could only dream of. He had been a Marine, trained for combat, but now his job was to sit in the shadows, his presence acknowledged only when something went wrong. VIP guests rarely even noticed him. They walked by with an air of entitlement, eyes skimming over him as though he were just another part of the decor. He had once thought that working hard would eventually pay off. But here, in this gilded cage, it only seemed to deepen the divide between him and the life he wanted. Brent, the manager, often sent him on the toughest, most undesirable duties, guarding the south entrance, monitoring VIP-only events. It was as if he were meant to remain hidden, like a shadow at the edge of the world, quietly doing his job while others walked freely in the light. When Darius had asked for a change of shift or a more visible role, the answer was always the same. "We need you here." Here, where no one could see him, where he was invisible to those who mattered. "You know, Darius, I don't know how you do it. I'd be losing my mind working that job every day," Brent jokes, his tone light, but the undercurrent of mockery was unmistakable. "Then again, it's just security, right? Not exactly a tough gig." Darius gritted his teeth but said nothing. Brent's voice cut through the night air, and his words stung like a slap, though the smile on his face suggested it was all in good fun. But it wasn't. For the millionth time, Brent reduced him to nothing more than security. The others in the room chuckled, nodding along as though the joke were somehow funny. They didn't know the hours he worked, the fatigue that gnawed at him day after day. They didn't see the way he pushed himself harder than anyone, just to be ignored at every turn. "Yeah, sure, but I'm sure you can handle it." "Tough guy, right?" Another worker chimed in, grinning. Darius forced a smile in return, though inside, it felt like his identity was being whittled away, piece by piece. They didn't see him as a person, just another stereotype, another black man standing in the background. The jokes piled up. They were small, insignificant, but like paper cuts, they bled him dry. It wasn't long before another security guard, one who had only been with the hotel for a few months, was given a promotion. Darius had watched it unfold like a bad dream. His co-worker, a younger white man named Kyle, stepping up to take the position Darius had wanted for years. When he approached Brent to ask why he wasn't considered, the response was as predictable as it was infuriating. "Well, Darius, you've got the experience, sure," Brent said, tapping his pen on the desk. "But there's something about your look. You've got that intense vibe. People might be intimidated by it. You know how it is in this business." Darius stood there, frozen for a moment. It was the same thing every time, a vague excuse, an unspoken acknowledgement that his blackness, his very presence, was the problem. But it wasn't his look that got in the way. It was something deeper, something systemic. "But Kyle's only been here for a few months," Darius argued, his voice tight with frustration. "What's the real reason?" Brent shook his head, a fake sympathy in his eyes. "It's just not the right fit, Darius. But don't worry, you're doing great work." The words felt hollow. Darius knew the truth, but hearing it out loud was a slap to the face. Kyle had the right look. He didn't intimidate anyone, but Darius? He would always be the one they overlooked. That night, the hotel hosted a high-profile event for a group of corporate executives. As usual, Darius was stuck on the night shift, guarding the perimeter while the rich and powerful swirled inside, oblivious to the man standing on the outskirts. It was then that he saw it. A VIP guest, drunk and leering, stumbling toward one of the housekeepers. The woman, young and nervous, tried to sidestep him, but he grabbed her arm, pulling her too close for comfort. Darius's blood boiled. He couldn't stand by and let it happen, not after everything he had seen, everything he had endured. He stepped forward, his voice low but firm. "Sir, please let go of her," he said, his hand resting on the man's shoulder. The man's eyes narrowed, his smirk turning into a sneer. "Who the hell are you to tell me what to do?" he slurred. "I'm security," Darius replied, his voice unwavering. "And I'm telling you to let go of her." The guest let out a gruff laugh, clearly not used to being challenged. But when Darius didn't back down, the man dropped his grip, muttering an insult under his breath. The housekeeper hurried away, clearly grateful but also embarrassed. Darius stood there, watching as she disappeared into the crowd, knowing that his act of protection would go unnoticed by everyone else. Later that night, Brent approached him. "Darius," he said, his tone cold, "I need to have a word." Darius turned to face him, the tension thick in the air. "What happened?" Brent's expression was hard. His lips pressed into a thin line. "You had no business intervening with that guest. You know how we do things here. He's a VIP. You should have called for backup, not made a scene." Darius's heart sank. The injustice of it hit him like a brick. He had done the right thing, but it meant nothing here. "No one's going to care about your little act of heroism," Brent continued, barely looking at him. "Just do your job, Darius." It was in that moment that Darius felt it. The undeniable truth that the system he was fighting against would never see him as more than a tool. His act of decency had been erased, just like everything else about him. The weight of his anger, frustration, and the endless cycle of racism finally came crashing down on him. How much longer could he remain silent? How much longer could he let the system crush his dignity? The morning after the incident, Darius stepped into the staff room, feeling the weight of last night's unresolved tensions. As the clock ticked closer to the scheduled meeting, anxiety gnawed at him. He had hoped that maybe Brent had seen reason, that maybe his actions had been justified, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The door creaked open, and Brent, with his usual smugness, entered. "All right, everyone," he announced, his tone a bit too sharp. "Let's get started. Darius, I'd like you to join us." His eyes briefly met Darius's, and there was no warmth in them, just a chilling detachment. The rest of the staff shuffled into their seats, but Darius stayed standing, his stomach churning. He knew what was coming. The tension in the room was palpable. Brent cleared his throat, taking a moment to adjust the papers in front of him, though Darius could tell it was all for show. He had rehearsed this. He already knew what he was going to say. "Yesterday, there was an incident," Brent began, his voice unnervingly calm. "Security footage shows Darius using excessive force against a guest." Darius's heart sank. The footage was clear. The video would show him intervening to stop a VIP from harassing a housekeeper, yet Brent was twisting it, turning the truth upside down. A murmur spread among the staff as Brent continued, "We take guest safety seriously here, and that kind of aggression isn't tolerated." Darius opened his mouth to speak, but the words stuck in his throat. His mind raced. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about a system that chose to protect the powerful and ignore the vulnerable. "You're lying," Darius said finally, his voice shaking but steady. "You're twisting the truth." Brent's eyes narrowed. "It's not your place to question authority, Darius. Do you really want to continue down this path?" The humiliation was public now. Every word, every glance from his co-workers burning into him. He had tried to protect someone, and now he was the one being attacked. "Brent, this is wrong." Darius tried again, louder this time. "The video shows everything. The guest was in the wrong. I was just doing my job." Brent slammed his hand on the table, his voice rising. "Enough, Darius. You don't get to question me in front of everyone. You need to leave, now." The command stung, but Darius stood firm. His legs felt heavy, but his resolve was stronger. The silence in the room felt suffocating. "I won't leave," Darius said, his eyes locked on Brent's. "Not like this. I haven't done anything wrong." Brent's face twisted into a mask of disgust. "You've gone too far. Don't make me have security escort you out." Darius felt the walls closing in. He was outnumbered, and the system had already decided his fate, but still, he wasn't ready to back down. His mind raced through every injustice he had faced here, every shift where he was pushed to the margins. "Darius, don't make this harder than it needs to be," Brent threatened, his tone venomous. But Darius stood tall, unwilling to let the humiliation break him. "I'm not the one making it hard, Brent. You are." Just as Darius felt the weight of the situation press down on him, a voice broke through the tension. I can't stay quiet anymore." The voice was hesitant but strong. It was the housekeeper, Maria, the one who had been harassed by the guest. She stood by the door, her face pale but determined. "Darius didn't do anything wrong. He was only trying to protect me." The room fell silent. The support, however small, felt like a lifeline to Darius. Maria's words hung in the air, but Brent was quick to shut her down. "You're dismissed, Maria," Brent snapped, not even looking her way. This doesn't concern you." Her shoulders slumped, but her eyes stayed on Darius for just a moment, offering him a silent reassurance. It was clear she couldn't speak out without risking her own job. The moment of solidarity was short-lived, and Brent's control over the room seemed even more absolute. He had silenced the one person who could back up Darius's story, and the others, the silent witnesses, remained still, afraid to speak up. As the meeting dragged on, Darius could feel his dignity being slowly stripped away, layer by layer. But then, something shifted. One of the other staff members, a young woman named Janet, subtly pulled out her phone and started recording the conversation. It was a small act, barely noticeable. But for Darius, it was a flicker of hope in the darkness. Someone, at least one person, saw the truth. Her eyes briefly met his, and she gave him a faint, encouraging nod. Janet's quiet rebellion wasn't much, but it was something. It was proof that not everyone was willing to accept the lies without a fight. "Darius, I'm not going to ask you again," Brent said, his voice dangerously low. "Leave, or I'll have security escort you out." It was the ultimate irony. Darius, the one who had done everything right, was now being forced to leave under threat of force. "You're making a mistake, Brent," Darius said, his voice trembling with barely contained anger. "You're protecting the wrong person." Brent's face remained cold, his eyes full of contempt. "This isn't a debate. Leave now or face the consequences." Darius hesitated for a moment, weighing his options. His pride, his sense of justice, everything told him to stand his ground. But the system had already made its decision, and fighting it alone seemed like a losing battle. "Fine," Darius muttered. "I'll go. But don't think this is over." The irony of the situation was suffocating. He, the one who had been wronged, was now the one being forced out. The power dynamics were as clear as they had ever been. With his head held high, Darius walked toward the exit. His footsteps were slow, heavy, the image of a man walking away, not in defeat, but with the weight of countless injustices on his shoulders lingered in the room long after he left. All he carried with him was a cheap umbrella, a symbol of how far he had fallen in the eyes of those in power. It wasn't much, but it was all he had left. His dignity had been stripped away, but his resolve remained. As the door closed behind him, Darius didn't look back. He knew the world would keep turning, but his fight had only just begun. The video hit social media like a tidal wave. Darius had barely gotten home, feeling the weight of everything that had happened, when his phone buzzed incessantly. It was a notification. "The video has gone viral." At first, he thought it was a joke, but as he scrolled, his heart sank. It was everywhere. The clip of Brent's aggressive confrontation with him, the slandering words, the false accusations, all of it, out in the world for anyone to see. Comments poured in, hundreds, then thousands. Some called for justice, others expressed disbelief. "Darius was right," one comment read. "This man was protecting the guests. Why is he getting fired?" Another, "When will this end? Another black man taken down for doing his job." And then the hashtag started. #justice for Darius. #fired for doing right. It was more than just a video. It was a symbol, a turning point. Darius realized in that moment that the scales were tipping. The public outrage was growing louder by the second, and he had no control over it anymore. The story had taken on a life of its own. His phone continued to buzz. He couldn't keep up with the notifications. This was bigger than anything he'd anticipated, and in a strange way it made him feel less alone. As the hours passed, the hashtag spread like wildfire. #justice for Darius and #fired for doing right began to trend. Thousands of people across the country joined in, using their voices to demand accountability. The sheer power of social media, a force Darius hadn't fully understood, had become a rallying cry for justice. "It's time for people to stop being afraid," one post read, accompanied by the hashtag, "We won't let this go unnoticed." Even those who had never met Darius began speaking up. "I'm a former employee of that hotel. Brent's been like this for years," one comment read, exposing long-standing issues within the workplace. Within hours, other incidents of discrimination, power abuse, and mistreatment began flooding the internet. The movement was no longer just about Darius. It had become a larger call to address the system of oppression that people like Brent thrived in. Darius sat there, watching it all unfold. His name was everywhere now, on news feeds, in social media posts, and even in everyday conversations. The ground beneath him had shifted. The fight was no longer just his, it was shared by thousands. The next day, Darius's story made headlines. News outlets all over the country were picking up the story. Every major network was discussing the hotel incident, with Darius's name now synonymous with the idea of standing up against injustice. The clip was replayed over and over, with people offering their own commentary. The accusations of excessive force quickly lost traction as more and more people watched the full video. Brent, who had once seemed untouchable, was now facing scrutiny. The tides had turned, and he was the one under fire. On one news station, a commentator said, "Brent's actions not only violate the ethics of his job, but they represent a larger pattern of abuse of power." And that was when the public began to dig deeper. They wanted answers, and they wanted them fast. Brent, who had once walked with confidence and arrogance, was now in the center of a media frenzy. His reputation, carefully crafted over the years, was crumbling before his eyes. He was no longer the untouchable boss. He was the face of a growing scandal. The support Darius received soon became more than just public outrage. It was institutional. A civil rights lawyer, known for her high-profile cases against workplace discrimination, reached out to Darius. "We'll take this to court," she said firmly, her voice steady but full of conviction. "This isn't just about you, it's about what's happening in those hotels and what's been happening for too long." And Darius wasn't alone. A veterans organization also called him, offering their support. "You served this country, and now we serve you," the message said. That call was a pivotal moment. For the first time, Darius felt like there was a real possibility of justice, not just for him, but for anyone who had been treated like he had. These legal and veteran organizations were rallying behind him, putting the pressure on the hotel and on Brent. The power dynamics were shifting. Now, Darius wasn't just a victim. He was part of a larger movement for change. Amidst all the chaos, the housekeeper who had witnessed everything came forward. Her statement was brief but powerful, recounting exactly what happened and how she had seen Darius try to de-escalate the situation. "He didn't deserve what happened," she said in the statement. "He was only doing his job, and no one should be treated that way." Her words added a layer of credibility to Darius's side of the story, and though she had been intimidated and silenced before, now she had found her voice. The housekeeper's courage to speak out gave others in the hotel industry the strength to follow suit. Her testimony quickly became a key part of the narrative. The hotel couldn't deny the truth anymore. With a public statement supporting Darius, they were on the defensive. One by one, employees from the hotel anonymously started to share their stories. They didn't show their faces, but their words were sharp, cutting through the silence that had once surrounded the toxic culture Brent had fostered. "They're scared to speak up," one message read. "But I'm not. I've seen Brent discriminate, bully, and manipulate for years. What happened to Darius isn't an isolated incident." Others followed, sharing similar tales of Brent's behavior, revealing a pattern of abuse that went far beyond one incident. Brent was no longer just a villain in a single story. He was exposed as the embodiment of a larger issue. As these anonymous stories piled up, the public's anger grew. The system that had protected people like Brent for so long was now on the verge of collapse. And with each new story, the hotel's defense became more and more untenable. The pressure was mounting. Hotel management, caught in the storm, was struggling to maintain control. They scrambled to protect their brand, knowing that this controversy could destroy everything they'd worked for. In a desperate move, they announced that Brent had been placed on leave pending investigation. It was a weak attempt to show they were taking action, but everyone knew it was just a cover-up. They were trying to avoid further damage, but they weren't fooling anyone. Darius, however, wasn't interested in their empty gestures. He knew the real work had only just begun. The fight for justice was far from over, and it was no longer about protecting one man's reputation. It was about dismantling a system that allowed people like Brent to operate unchecked for far too long. The battle had shifted, and Darius was no longer just a victim. He was a symbol of the change that was coming. The next morning, Darius was sitting behind the counter of his new job at a local coffee shop when the bell above the door jingled. He looked up, expecting another customer, but it wasn't anyone he recognized. Brent stood there, looking unrecognizable. His crisp suit was wrinkled, his hair unkempt, his usually confident demeanor replaced with visible defeat. His eyes were downcast, and the air between them was thick with unspoken words. "Darius," Brent's voice cracked, breaking the silence. "I need to talk to you." Darius's heart didn't race. It didn't skip a beat. He just gazed at Brent, unfazed, as the weight of his actions seemed to crush the man who had once held power over him. "I didn't think you'd come," Darius replied. Keeping his voice steady, Brent shifted nervously as if unsure of how to begin. The buzz of the coffee machine filled the background, but it felt distant now, irrelevant. "You're right," Brent said, his voice laced with regret. "I thought I could get away with it. I thought I could brush everything under the rug. But—" He hesitated, his lips trembling. "But now, everything's changed. People are talking about me. I lost everything." Darius didn't respond immediately. He just stared at him, his silence louder than any words could have been. Brent took a step closer, his hands shaking. "Please, Darius. I know I've messed up. I can't lose everything. I'm begging you. I need your help." There was an edge of desperation in his voice. The man who had once held all the power now stood before Darius, vulnerable, and on the verge of collapse. His pride seemed to have vanished with his career. "I never wanted to be the one to bring you down," Brent continued, his eyes now pleading. "I didn't know what I was doing. I was wrong. You were right about everything." Darius didn't react to the words. His expression remained unchanged as he absorbed the weight of the moment. Darius finally stood up, not in anger, but in calm composure. His movements were deliberate, his posture confident. A man no longer defined by someone else's actions. "You think this is about a job?" Darius asked softly, yet the power behind his words sent ripples of realization through the air. "This isn't about a job, Brent. This is about respect, about being seen for who I am, not just who you wanted me to be." He paused, his eyes narrowing as he looked directly into Brent's eyes, making sure the gravity of his words sank in. "I didn't come here for your charity. I came here to show you that no one, no matter how high they are, has the right to make someone feel less than human." Brent's face flushed, a mix of embarrassment and realization. Darius continued, "You've had your time. You had the power, the control. But that doesn't mean I'm going to let you or anyone else dictate my worth." Brent, at this point, looked like he had no words left to say. He had laid his soul bare, or so he thought. But Darius wasn't moved. Without a word, Darius took a step back and picked up his jacket, preparing to leave. There was no anger, no harsh words. He didn't need to say anything else. Brent's eyes widened. Realization dawned on him like a cold wave. You're not going to help me?" Darius shook his head slightly, not even glancing at him. His silence was more powerful than any angry rebuttal. "No," Darius said, his voice quiet yet firm. "I'm not. You've already shown me who you are." And with that, Darius walked past Brent, his strides purposeful, leaving the broken man standing in the midst of his own downfall. Darius walked out of the coffee shop, the door swinging closed behind him. He was calm, his face a portrait of composure. His daughter, waiting outside, smiled up at him. Together, they walked down the street, their bond unshaken, a symbol of resilience and triumph. As they turned the corner, Darius held his head high, each step further from the man who had once tried to break him. The camera would have followed them, but the message was clear. Darius's journey wasn't about vengeance, it was about personal victory. It was about reclaiming his dignity, his worth, and walking away from the man who had tried to define him. And with that, the world would soon see the full extent of what true justice meant, not in retribution, but in the quiet strength of moving forward. The camera panned out, the sound of their footsteps fading into the distance, leaving the past behind for good. And as the sun set on that day, a new chapter began. Think about it for a moment. Have you ever been in a situation where doing the right thing cost you more than you ever expected? Where standing up for yourself or someone else meant facing a harsh consequence, losing a job, friendships, or even your peace of mind? Darius knew the weight of that choice all too well. He stood tall, but it wasn't easy. Sometimes doing what's right comes with a price. It's not always about the immediate victory, but about the integrity you hold on to when everything else crumbles. Have you been there? When the world expects you to stay silent, but something inside tells you that you can't. We want to hear your stories. Share your experiences with us. Whether you've had to stand up against injustice, deal with the systemic oppression, or simply face a situation where doing the right thing costs you more than you bargained for. Let's stand together and speak out. Together, we can make a difference, one story at a time. If you believe in justice, if you believe in the power of standing up for what's right, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Stay connected for more stories that need to be told. Your voice matters. Let's keep this conversation going.